Hi everyone. Yeah, we're going to talk about the work we've been doing on merchant payments. I'm sure many of you know I've been rambling on about this for about 6 months or so. I'm going to hand over to Lewis to do the introduction, and then we can provide context, and Justus can take us through the work we've been doing recently on developing a backlog. So over to you, Lewis.
Cool. Hi everyone. You've got me again. I should actually, while I'm here, reveal my true identity as Miller Light. I do apologize, Miller, for the cheap pun.
But I still, the mystery of who is Brian greater than Miller, we still need to figure that out.
Yeah, we'll get there. We'll get there. Cool. All right. Awesome. Well, thanks everyone for being with us. So we're just going to give a bit of a summary of what we talked about, and one of our and kind of a bit more context, resharing and expanding on that, looking through the backlog that we've been working and understanding the users and user stories, and then talking through some of our demo plan. So this was from the last PI, our goal board. We had 3 main objectives. One was to be able to demonstrate a very simple block list and QR payment process where someone could do a QR payment and then to a merchant, so customer to, what is it called, C to B, customer to a business, and demonstrate how there could be some kind of blocking taking place. Secondly, to build out a backlog for what it would look like to go from the simple demo to something that is fully featured and viable in the marketplace. And finally, to road test our thinking at a hackathon event, which looked, at the time, I think it looked likely, and a few things have changed, and we all know that the holidays happened and that they're over now for most of us. And so, yeah, we ended up focusing most of our attention on the backlog and doing some of the discovery around that. And we are going to be talking about the plan for the demo now that we have actually got someone to do that, to help us with our demo. I'll talk about that at the end. So that's kind of a high-level look at what we've been up to. And now I'll just hand over to Paul to talk us through a bit more of the context around why this is important and where our focus is now, because I think our focus is perhaps just getting a bit more nuanced, or yeah, perhaps shifting, I'm not sure.
Focused.
Yeah, focused. Yeah, our focus is getting more focused, which is always a good thing. Cool. Paul, please take it away before I...
Yeah, okay. I'm going to briefly go through this just to provide context and background, really. So this was essentially learnings from a deployment we were working on. I must hasten to say that it's not Myanmar, for those in doubt. So we're initially focused on interoperable merchant payments, making it work for customers with a variety of technological and financial literacy in a merchant environment. We were focused on the simple to begin with, quotes. So a customer initiated payment, so a customer pushing a payment, merchant initiated, and fintech or app initiated, 3PPI, PISP, etc. They're further down the roadmap, but let's walk before we can run, as opposed to run before we can walk. So the customer, as we envisage it, can use either static QR code or USSD, and the merchant receives the payments instantly, so they get the notification and they can release the goods. And the obvious aim is for it to be entirely interoperable against all connected DFSPs, all those that are connected to a particular instance of a Mojaloop deployment. So that includes banks, MFIs, mobile wallets, SACCOs, anyone else who is qualified to be connected to a hub. Next slide, please. So what we're doing, we're developing that customer-initiated merchant payments infrastructure. This is not built into the hub itself. It's a modular extension around the hub. So we're viewing the hub, the deployment of the hub, as a utility that facilitates merchant payments. We are, in our thoughts at least, very focused on fraud and money laundering detection, because we are very aware that merchant payments is often a route to money laundering in particular. And we know that there's plenty of fraud goes on in the merchant POS environment. So we're using a merchant registry and a merchant identity as the platform, the underpinning to address those issues. We are building this capability, this modular extension, independent of the front-end technology. Initially, we want to support USSD because we know how important USSD is in the target markets, even though USSD is, frankly, horrible technology. And we will want to support QR codes because it looks better. It makes for a more impressive demo. And also it's a lot quicker for a customer transaction within a merchant premises. So you're not mucking around managing USSD sessions. And I gather that I've moved on already. Thank you, Lewis. I was just going to say we're using static QR codes to begin with, and we'll move to dynamic QR codes later. The difference being the static QR code simply identifies the merchant. A dynamic QR code does that and also encapsulates the transaction details. And we're also wanting to use signed QR codes so that you know that nobody's been messing around with the QR code, which implies the use of public key cryptography so that we can verify the signature on a QR code. I'd emphasize that merchant payments really aren't straightforward. We're doing it at the simple end and building out from there. Having spent most of my 30+ year career working in retail payments, I can promise you there are captures everywhere. We've got to be really confident about what we're doing and not build in opportunities for fraud and theft and money laundering, etc., into what we're building. So we're going to build this on top of instant payments. We're going to expose merchant payment details, but using an alias. So we're going to expose a merchant ID, which means that we are going to require merchant registration. That allows us to control who can accept retail payments. This is different from P2P. And therefore we can identify and control fraudulent activity. And then we are going to start running increasingly into regulatory and supervisory requirements around spotting fraudulent transactions, money laundering, and who is actually the ultimate beneficial owner of a business, which is an important concept because we get people setting up multiple shops under different identities, but there is one ultimate beneficial owner. And that identifying the UBO is really the only way to spot money laundering in many cases. And as I said, we need to support multiple payment initiation methods chosen by the customer. I mean, in many of the countries that we're wanting to deploy this, USSD is at least 50% of the anticipated transactions, probably more like 90%. So we have to support it. And going QR code only is just irrational in many of these markets. Next slide, Lewis. Yeah, this is just to say QR code payments are an order of magnitude more complex than dynamic, are an order of magnitude more complex than static. You have to be supplying QR codes on the fly. They have to be signed. You have to be checking a merchant registry each time to make sure that the merchant is legitimate, hasn't recently been red flagged, etc., etc. It's doing the static QR code is the way to go for an initial proof of concept. Next slide. And yeah, this is to emphasize that what we're doing is building extension modules here. The Mojaloop hub, as I said, I'm sure there are many people who will hate me for this, we're treating it as a utility. It is providing the payment service, the funds transfer service that underpins merchant payments. We are developing a merchant registry module, which simply maintains information about the merchants. Separately, we're developing the merchant payments extension module, which actually orchestrates the payments between the customer and the merchant. And there's the fraud and money laundering module off the side, which monitors external resources, which I haven't mentioned here, things like police records and company registrations and all that good stuff that Justus is very much focused on, and using those to update our merchant registry so we know which of these merchants is actually a thieving scoundrel and we should not be dealing with them. All of these elements have to be in place for a fully fledged solution. However, that's not what we're doing for the moment. That's further down the roadmap. Next slide. Yeah, we had some considerations that we wanted to place on the merchant registry. We've looked at the Mojaloop ALS Oracle duo as a candidate for implementation, and it does look appropriate. It'll need extension. Extensions to oracles are not unusual. For MMD, for Myanmar, we are already looking at developing extensions to the oracle specifically for some of the use cases that we have there. So there are precedents for developing the oracle further, and the infrastructure around it. The merchant registry, as I've said, has to look in 3 directions. So it carries out its traditional Mojaloop role. It supports the transaction routing, the get parties, etc. It also has to validate individual transactions against the AML fraud assessment. So a lookup to see whether this merchant is currently blacklisted or not. And it has to work with an external fraud money laundering KYB engine to evaluate merchant status dynamically, because merchant status is not a fixed thing. We have to be aware of the latest police reports, etc. Not in real time. I mean, real time, if we're looking in this case, is measured in days, not minutes. Next slide. And on the customer front end, we have to support, as I've said, customer initiated, merchant request to pay, 3PPI coming later, as 3PPI is better deployed. We've validated an outline design against USSD and static QR, and we've done some design thinking for dynamic QR. That's building on work we actually did in Myanmar 18 months ago. We need to engage with major in-country retail payments ecosystem players for any sort of pilots here. And I must emphasize again, we're talking about push, not pull here. So it's a push instant payment. Next question. Yeah, these are the lessons that we've drawn from multiple projects. In my case, not just within Mojaloop, but in retail payments, working with World Bank, IFC, Midyar, and countless others. We separate the rails from the services, and you've seen that in what we've talked about already. The rails is the Mojaloop hub. It's providing the functionality to move money from A to B. The service is a merchant payment running over the top of those rails. Interoperability we get for free, as it were, from utilizing the Mojaloop hub, but we're making sure we're providing business interoperability as well. And part of that is saying that we're not supporting on-us payments for merchant transactions. They should go through the hub. We have to make merchant transactions free, and that's a lesson from UPI. Trying to charge for merchant transactions just drives people towards cash. We really don't want to do that, because cash is our ultimate competitor here, nothing else. And we have to make sure that customers can use it. So we have to use a customer-facing technology that is appropriate to our audience. The making it free one is a difficult one. Essentially, there are solutions around that, around providing services to merchants. It's all about supporting the merchant, not necessarily charging for a transaction. So separating, virtualizing the fees you make, not connecting them to transactions at all. Next slide, Lewis. And here I hand over to Justus. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. So one of the things that we were also tasked with was to try and figure out exactly what would it involve to provide for the minimum functionality that we need to achieve Paul's goals. The approach that we followed was to just work through our financial ecosystem, identify the major stakeholders that we want to cater for upfront through an MVP. Behind these primary stakeholders, you would also find a number of secondary and tertiary stakeholders, like the hub operators themselves, merchant companies as their holding and shareholders, and then the regulatory and compliance bodies that are supposed to govern the merchants or the flow of finances through the ecosystem. But primarily from an MVP perspective, we looked at the merchants themselves, the merchants' customers, the DFSPs, who would typically be the operator or the host of a merchant's transactional facility, and then what we call the payment scheme operator, specifically administering the merchant registry and the ability for a switch to find a route to a merchant's transactional facility to transfer funds from a customer's wallet, for example. Once we'd identified all of the various stakeholders, we went to just document from an objective perspective or as a use case exactly what the objectives are of each of these people in the ecosystem. What do the individual stakeholders want to achieve? And then take that to another layer down is what is the infrastructure, service, and processes we need to build in order to facilitate those objectives. The work around the infrastructure, services, and processes is probably skipping a little bit ahead of a traditional backlog and deals with the how. That's still a work in progress, so we're still skinning that layer of the onion. But I'd like to just take you through, Lewis, if you can go to the next slide, just our high-level objectives of those four roles in the platform. So as a customer who is trying to purchase something, the customer's objective here is to buy goods and services from the merchant. There's a number of process archetypes that we had sort of worked through. Very basically, a customer would be presented with an invoice or a slip of some kind by the merchant, and then also with the QR code that the merchant has available to identify a route or a convenient route to the merchant's transactional facility or to the merchant itself. And then the customer would scan that QR code, capture the amount that they would like to pay, may include a service fee or even a tip if you're at the restaurant, for example, and then it would present that payment to the merchant. The merchant would then accept the payment and then conclude the transaction, hand over the goods, or the customer is free to leave without having to wash the dishes. In addition to that, this puts a slightly different burden on the ecosystem than just traditionally switching a transaction. So in our debate on the topic, switching the transaction between DFSPs, the relationship between the DFSP and the customer is the one that is typically managed by the DFSP. The switch itself does not get involved in that relationship at all. So if a customer has a complaint about a transaction or something about the DFSP's performance itself, they would typically take that up with the DFSP. The merchant, on the other hand, is almost like a separate autonomous body that sits somewhere in the ecosystem, and the customer may not necessarily have a direct line to complain about the merchant's behavior in terms of some in relation to the ecosystem itself. So a customer may feel like they had been defrauded or cheated by a merchant, and where does the customer go? They would maybe go to the police, but they may also want to bring that to the attention of the DFSP themselves. So it would be useful if there was a way for the customer to raise a flag. Those kind of flags that are typically raised out of behaviors are also something that is used in a fraud management systems feedback loop to identify behavior related to the merchant almost in a retroactive fashion. So we thought that that might be a useful feature to also include from the customer's perspective. And then being able to look up merchant information. If you scan that merchant's QR code, for example, you want to know that you are talking about the correct merchant. If you want to raise a complaint, or if you want to contact somebody at the merchant for maybe a warranty issue or something like that, you could always look up the merchant information that is publicly available, has been published for you to then look up. From a DFSP perspective, actually, let's deal with the merchant first. The merchant obviously wants to register as a merchant, and we want people to register as merchants so that we can explicitly identify them for a specific set of scheme-driven behaviors. In reality, if you are an informal merchant and you have a small stand selling oranges next to the side of the road, and you are accepting wallet-to-wallet payments from customers who are passing by, you are effectively behaving as a merchant, but you can do that without having to register as a merchant. The registration process here is probably focused a little bit more at established merchants, but also to allow the merchant to benefit from merchant-related features from the ecosystem, specifically the issuing of this QR code. I don't need to capture somebody's mobile number or their wallet ID to be able to send them money. I can now just scan their QR codes. From a convenience perspective, there is an incentive for a merchant to also register as a merchant. The merchant should have the ability to update their information, even as far as updating ownership information, and scheme rules should determine whether that merchant should still be considered the same entity, or maybe even be the entity ownership structure, or the entity structure itself should be updated, and maybe a previous merchant registration should be closed as a result. If there is support requested, a QR code for some reason isn't working or anything like that, the merchant should have a channel for support. That would not necessarily be a system-driven process, but just a business process that would have to be implemented to support the merchant. The merchant will have to have the ability to accept payments, which is obviously at the core of this functionality. And then a merchant should be able to request that QR code in support of their registration. And we had, when we looked at this particular use case, broken this down into a number of ways in which a QR code could potentially be disseminated to the merchants, and largely for, I suppose, from a DFSP perspective, or even a scheme operator perspective, in a way that is most convenient for the merchant itself. And then looking at if something goes wrong with your QR code, for some reason your QR code has been compromised, or you've changed enough of your information to warrant the issuing of a new QR code, you should be able to request a new QR code through the system or platform. A DFSP, when we looked at registration of a merchant, we looked at two options. You could either provide a portal where a merchant could self-register, or you could provide an option for the DFSP to register merchants on the merchant's behalf after following some kind of onboarding process that is native to that DFSP. The DFSP can then issue a QR code. And then in addition to that, the DFSP should also be able to look up merchant information, and in particular, look up merchant information for the DFSP that hosts the transactional facility for that merchant. So if a merchant is found to be in contravention of the scheme rules or not complying with basic compliance regulatory challenges, a DFSP only really has control over a merchant that has a facility with that DFSP. So if anybody wanted to take any action against the DFSP that is somewhere else, you would need to know exactly where the DFSP is in the first place. The merchant would also be able to request support from the scheme operator. So for any issues that they may have in administering or managing the merchants on the platform, and provide administrative support to the merchants. So If a merchant has an issue that needs to be resolved by the DFSP, they can do that, and the DFSP should have the tools available to help the merchant or even escalate an issue to the scheme operator for a slightly more intensive and administrative support approach. And then the scheme operator is the entity that administers the merchant registry at large, facilitates the registration of those merchants, hosts that register, and also has a number of functions that they perform at a higher level. The blocking and unblocking of merchants. So a DFSP should have the ability to block its own merchant from receiving payments and also unblock its own merchant from receiving payments. They shouldn't have the ability to arbitrarily block merchant payments when that merchant a relationship is held by another DFSP. The scheme operator, by contrast, should have a more blanket access across the platform to be able to block merchants that they feel do not comply with the scheme rules. Also to be able to unblock merchants. When it comes to blocking and unblocking, we imagine that it would be some kind of business process to maybe arbitrate or to escalate the blocks that have been imposed. That's not upfront the scope of our backlog at the moment, and we expect that something like that would be facilitated outside of the platform from a software perspective. The scheme operator would be required to publish those public key certificates that enable the security of the QR codes, and also to monitor the merchant compliance status. Monitoring the compliance status is in one way with the scheme rules, but also regulatory and supervisory compliance, and any support that could be offered through a fraud risk management solution that evaluates both merchant behavior and transactions to and from merchant accounts. And then finally, maybe years down the line, when you get to a point where you need to purge historical data, that would also be the scheme operator's responsibility. Next slide, please, Lewis. And then we looked at the kind of features that we would need to enable the solution in general, and some of the principles that we would like to aim for. These are some of the features that we have come up with so far. All of the microservices should be accessible via API. So merchant registration, request for support, request to block and unblock an account or a merchant at large. All of these should be facilitated through a range of microservices, and those microservices should all be appropriately secured. We'd also like to, maybe not immediately and upfront, but it would be useful if there was an online portal where some of those services could be exposed for user interaction that is then controlled by role-based access control that could be administered by the scheme operator. And any of the roles of people who are interacting with the system should be subject to role-based access control. We proposed multiple mechanisms for QR code delivery, whether it is a downloadable link or a pre-printed and delivered, or however that may want to happen within a specific scheme's scope and focus. The data interfaces themselves should be baselined around what we are expecting, but also to be extensible. When it comes to the determination of the ultimate beneficial owner or the ownership structure of a merchant and the very complex nature of how holding companies and operating companies are interrelated and all the people involved, we expect that there may be some the need to start collecting additional information. The merchant registry, again, by contrast to the Mojaloop switch, probably needs to know more about the people who are using the platform than the Mojaloop switch does. So there's a lot more data that we envisage may have to be collected. And then, as Paul also mentioned, the centralized merchant registration and ID issuing, so that you have a unique identifier for a specific merchant instance across your ecosystem, hosted centrally by the scheme, so that you don't have individual DFSPs with their own view of the merchant and a means of identification that's only relevant to that DFSP. And then finally, all of our QR codes must be securely signed. Yes, I think that's me.
Cool, thank you, Justus. So I think the last thing to kind of talk about here is just plan for the demo. we want to do, we've got kind of this backlog, and we're going to pick a few things off that backlog to demonstrate at a very preliminary stage what the flow would look like for a customer and for a merchant. So we're going to use some pre-generated static QR codes. We're assuming that there's a merchant registry. We're just going to reuse the existing Oracle and just register a merchant ID type. And we're going to build upon the existing demo that Coil had contributed to the community called Demo Mojaloop, which is a web-based app, which already looks really nice. And what we're calling done is going to be a wallet that's running locally on someone's machine that can initiate a QR payment that then goes through to the Mojaloop sandbox. And the last bit of good news is that we have an intern lined up to do this for us. So I'm not sure if Sam's on the call. It's pretty late here, and he's probably sleeping, but we have Sam George, who's attending a university from my hometown, and he's joined the team for the next, probably a couple months to help us build out this demo. And so we're looking forward to him learning a lot and to seeing what he's got to share at the next PI. I think that's all for us. So there's been a bit of chat in the chat box. So I'm not sure if we want to have any more conversation here, Simeon, or if we've got time for that. But other than that, I'll just thank you for
thanks, Paul. Thanks, Justus. Thanks, Lewis. Unfortunately, we've run out of time. I would encourage Lewis, Justus, if you guys can just go on the chat and respond to any of the questions. And if anybody has any further questions, just feel free to put them in the chat. And I will quickly pass this over back again to Paul for the bulk payments enhancement session.